And today we're going to be talking about a very highly controversial topic on should churches remain tax exempt. And by churches, I mean any religious institution that the government qualifies to be tax exempt. So it's not just Christianity, it's all sorts of other religions, such as the Church of Scientology, which we'll talk about later. So we're going to talk about two sides. We're going to talk about those who are for taxing churches, and I'm going to just use the term churches as a general reference, makes it a lot simpler. And those who are against taxing churches or in favor of keeping the current regulations in current remaining tax exempt. So in order to understand what's going on, we need to focus on the regulations that the IRS or the Internal Revenue Service in places for this. So they don't have to file a 990EZ, which is an annual file for companies or nonprofits that have to fill it out saying that they're tax exempt. They don't have to do that. What the IRS does is they're automatically exempt from any tax, so they don't have to worry about any income that comes into the church. And that is written out in section 501c3, where it states that churches are nonprofits. So instead of it being a church or religious institution, they act as nonprofits through the IRS, and they're exempt from property tax and income tax. And that's kind of the generic one, but in some places, like some states and some local areas, they're also exempt from sales tax, but that varies from place to place. Churches do have restrictions though because of this. So the IRS puts restrictions on them saying that they can't be politically influential or lobbying because church has to remain separate from the government. So in order for them to be tax exempt, they can't be using that money that they're bringing in to lobby political influences in the government. And so then I wrote this diagram up here to kind of give you an idea, and I'll talk about this later. So income tax and property tax. So this is the income that the church brings, or tithes, a tither. A lot of times it's given through donations from people in the church, and that comes into the church. It does not go to the government. It's for the church, which they can use for programs, which I'll kind of explain later because that comes up important. And the fundamental part of this debate is in the First Amendment, which we'll talk about. That's in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. And this is what it states: Congress shall not make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So that's important to understand when we're talking about this debate. So in order to understand both sides, you have to understand how much money is brought into the religious institution. According to the State of the Plate, which is an organization focusing on statistics that come in the churches and religious institutions, more than $50 billion comes in annually. And this, although this study was only focused on tithers that give every or 10% or more of their income to churches, so other studies bring figures closer to about $100 billion a year, but there was no solid confirmed, it's just an estimate that's given to churches. Whoops. So let's talk about those that are against taxing the church. So those that are against taxing the church often bring up the Walls versus Tax Commission of the City of New York. This is a very famous case. It occurred on May 4th, 1970. And during this case, there was an argument as far as if churches being tax exempt would keep them separate from the government or make them part of the government. So this right here, the government can't establish a religion. So the debate was, if the government allows them to be tax exempt, are they, an established part of the government, are they, favoring them? And it was ruled that they were not favoring them, since they're acting as nonprofits and it's a religious institution. And that's what was determined in that court case. Another thing is, so it violates free expression of religion. So the idea behind this is that people that go to church or practice a religion are, if they're taxed, what that does is it can put a hinder on the institution that they're part of and not allow them to participate in that religion as easily or do as they wish to do. So if that hinders that, then they claim that it would be violating our religious freedom. And so that's a really strong argument for that side. And then moving on to, okay, so churches do for the public. So this is where that program comes in. So that program, they argue, is good. So that $50 billion that I mentioned earlier, they use this as a really strong argument to support the programs that they use. Churches are known for doing programs for the homeless, providing them shelter, such as like, or even feeding people that don't have enough money for it, such as soup kitchens. They also have programs for parents that can't afford maybe watching their kids, or they have jobs, so they have after-school programs to help take care of that. And they do a lot of that, and they argue that all that money that comes in is greatly used in these programs. So that's a solid argument for them. And then, so then the place government above religion. They argue that if we tax churches and religious institutions, that what will happen is that will put the government above whatever their religion is, hindering that. And as a religion, oftentimes that's your number one goal, and they don't want the government to be above that. They argue that as well. But if you go on to the other side of the spectrum, so those who are in favor of taxing the church, let me go back just a second. I want to talk about one more thing. So there was another court case in 1819, McCollum versus Maryland, and they stated, and this is under that it violates free expression of religion. So like I was saying earlier, how that tax will hinder it. There was a court case about that in 1819, and they stated this: the power to tax is the power to destroy. So meaning that it would destroy the institutions that are in place. So there was a definite solid court case over that. And this all occurred in the Supreme Court, not like a little dinky one. So, so those that are for taxing it, all right, so that same court case that I mentioned earlier, Walls versus the Tax Commission of the City of New York, they use this as a strong argument too, because in that court case, like I mentioned earlier, they argued that if we allow for tax exemption, we are violating this in the First Amendment, and that that we cannot allow that because it would violate that, and they didn't believe that it should be violated. But as we know, that was not ruled in that court case. And then since the IRS, like I mentioned earlier, there's not a solid, strong regulation on it. So basically, they don't really dip into it. The IRS stated themselves that, for people that take courses in an educational video, they stated that the tax laws with church and institutions are quite vague, and it's not really a solid, like, there's not straight written how it is. So religious institutions can file differently, and it's kind of vague as what they consider to be that. So it makes it easy for what they argue fakes. They often refer to, like Time Magazine referred to the Church of Scientology as a thriving cult of greed and power. And this was in 1993 that Time Magazine called them that, because there was many beliefs during that time that perhaps the Church of Scientology was using their power of being tax exempt, which was granted to them, I believe, in '94. So a little bit before Time Magazine released their statement before they were tax exempt, as an argument that they're using it for greed and power, or churches that have a pay to enter, pay to be part of, like pay to participate sort of fee. They were arguing against that. They also argue that some churches or religious institutions might use it to take advantage of people, and that there should be some sort of way to sort of regulate that and make sure that these religious institutions aren't taking advantage of being tax exempt. They also argue that it's a lot of lost revenue for the government, which can go to programs that help people like churches that they do. So those programs that they are definitely in favor of. they argue that if the money went to the government, that it could be used for the same programs. And an estimate just in property taxes, the government loses out on about $83.5 billion annually, just in property taxes, not an income tax from churches. And strong advocates of the not for taxing churches and religious institutions bring that number up a lot, and that does come from the IRS. That number does, and now that we've kind of looked at both sides of it, this debate does go on much larger than uncovering. It's hard to cover it in about a 6-minute period, but it does leave a question for as far as how should we approach the issue, and understanding both sides I think is very important. And now that I presented kind of some arguments from both sides and some facts and statistics, that you'll be able to take this information and use it how you wish. Thank you very much.